It is a pleasure to welcome you today to this panel. There is a global expectation that once we have a working COVID-19 vaccine, we're going to be able to get back to normal life. And I think that sounds pretty great to all of us. And there is a big focus on the development of that vaccine and an assumption that the supply chain is simply going to do its job. So our objective today is to look at what needs to happen. What are the challenges that have to be overcome in order for the supply chain to be able to do its job? And not only do we want to think about the challenges that we're facing, but we hope to take it one step further to look at how the state-of-the-art tools that we have available to us in supply chain management can be deployed to make vaccine delivery work better, be faster, and also morph more naturally into the next vaccines that need to be developed. Tyson Browning and I serve as co-editors-in-chief of the Journal of Operations Management, which is a leading academic journal that specializes in operations and supply chain management that is owned by ASCM. Tyson and I will be moderating today's panel. This panel takes place in the context of a special issue on the impact of COVID-19 on supply chains that has guest editors, Professors Jean de Zhao and Chris Voss. Jean is from China Europe International Business School, and Chris is from London and Warwick Business Schools, who are with us today. And then other guest editors are Zhang Li, from Beijing University of Chemical Technology, and Hao Li from Stanford Business School. Our panelists are Jean Wang, who's the CFO of CanSino Biologicals, Mahesh Varina, who's the CEO of Cloudleaf, Alex de Jonquière, who is the Director of Health Systems and Immunization Strengthening at Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance, and Professor Scott Comeners from Harvard Business School. With that, I will pass it over to Tyson.
Thank you, Suzanne, and welcome all panelists. We're delighted to have you with us. We'd like to start by asking you to please briefly describe how the supply chain for a COVID-19 vaccine looks to you. So, Jean, would you please start?
Sure. Thank you very much. And as a Chief Financial Officer in CanSino Biologics, the company has already focused on the high quality, innovative, and affordable vaccines for more than 11 years. So during this pandemic, all of the companies and people are working, day and night, 7 days per week to fight against the diseases by pushing the vaccine candidate into the clinical trial and conducting clinical trial. And currently we are focusing in the scale up and in manufacturing the vaccines. So it's a unbelievable year for us, for all of us.
Okay, thank you, Mahesh.
Yeah, thank you, Tyson. Again, my name is Mahesh Varina, CEO of Cloudleaf. We provide digital software solutions for supply chain, so we're right in the thick of it. One of our core focus is especially the cold chain logistics, working with a number of the pharma life science ecosystem players since the COVID pandemic began, like the brands, bulk producers, container and packaging solutions, and the logistics service providers. So it's a huge challenge. A lot of attention on the research R&D itself and so on. But if you look at the logistics, number of challenges, especially we have to move these at cryo temperatures and so on. Is the infrastructure really ready for it? And we can discuss as we go along the panel some interesting happenings that are going on today.
Very good, thank you, Alex.
Okay, so I think just to start by saying Gavi, for those that don't know us, is a public-private partnership that whose mission is to ensure that essentially children in the poorest countries have access to the same vaccines as children in the richest countries. And we're also, along with WHO and CEPI, managing the COVAX facilities, trying to accelerate access to COVID vaccines globally. I think as we think about the supply chain challenge in this context, I mean, to me, I think about it in the upstream and the downstream. I think the upstream, obviously, there's a critical need to get the vaccines manufactured and delivered to countries. And we saw in the context of the COVID pandemic, the huge impact that had on international air travel and air transportation capacity, which made it hard to even get routine vaccines to countries. And we're talking about a volume of vaccine here, which is many times higher in a short period of time than we would normally be shipping. So that's one area, one challenge. But equally important, if not even more important and challenging, is going to be the downstream. We are going to be dealing with distributing these vaccines through in-country supply chains, which are, although they're much stronger than they were a decade ago, are still have weaknesses and challenges. And I think two things I'd call out in particular within that. One is that we're dealing with a vaccine where scarcity means there's going to be a much higher risk of diversion, of counterfeiting, and also a much higher cost of wasting the vaccine than there is with most vaccines. And so the ability to trace vaccine through the system is going to be more important. The second is we're also talking about a number of vaccines that may need ultra cold chain. And if that turns out to be the case, and by ultra cold chain, I mean vaccines being refrigerated at -70, -80 degrees. If that turns out to be the case, we have a very different challenge. Most countries could accommodate a large number of doses in standard cold chain, 2 to 8 or -20 degrees. But if vaccines are going to require ultra cold chain, then that's going to be a very different challenge. So I think we need to think about each of those steps in the chain quite separately, recognizing that they're actually interconnected, but they're actually different supply chains that are managed by different people.
Good, thank you. Scott.
So thank you so much for having me on the panel. I'm part of a group of economists that make up the Accelerating Health Technologies team that's been sort of working on a number of different economic challenges around incentivizing and deploying COVID-19 vaccines. From our perspective, the really big supply chain challenge is about investment in capacity, right? There's a tremendous need to build capacity up front. And in advance, right? The flow costs of the pandemic are on the order of hundreds of billions a month. And so it's worth it to invest in capacity at risk, because if you can speed up the deployment of a vaccine by just a month, that's a huge social value. And meanwhile, there's a different incentive challenge, which is that a lot of the firms that produce these vaccines are under significant pressure, either sort of direct or internal per preference, to price the vaccines at cost. Which is great in terms of ensuring access, but it means that they don't have as much incentive to develop their capacity themselves, right? If you're not going to be making a profit off of a vaccine, your incentive to expand capacity dramatically is far reduced. And so there's a real need to subsidize capacity. And and again, the more of it we build, the faster we can deploy the vaccine and the faster we can get it to everyone, right? The capacity stays, you can use it to produce more and more tranches of doses, and that particularly helps with deployment, like to countries that don't have as much ability to pay for or produce the vaccines themselves as well.
Very good, thank you. So with that quick view from each panelist on some of the challenges they see in the COVID supply chain, let's focus for a moment on logistics. So what are the most important logistical challenges in vaccine supply chains? For example, maintaining the cold chain or ultra cold chain. And what can be done in terms of supply chain design to avoid the worst of these challenges? So we'll go through our 4 panelists in the same order, starting with Jane to respond.
Okay, thank you. So for sure, the maintained cold chain is the most critical part in logistics. And from the developer and the manufacturer's point of view, we have to try our best to do a better vaccine product design. For example, if we can maintain the storage and the transportation for a vaccine in 2 to 8 degrees centigrade, and by the longer stability data, it will be much better to provide a vaccine that can maintain the room temperature for 2 to 3 weeks to enable the final delivery for the vaccination. And we all know that for the vaccines with a -20 to 70 degree will require a cryogenic refrigerator, which is almost impossible for most of the countries. So that is the very key for the scientist. And another one is we're trying the best to provide a single dose. If the single dose vaccine that can provide good safety and the protection, then that will be much better, to give the more doses immunization program. So that is the job of our scientists are doing every day. Currently, according to the Consano Biologics vaccine product, we have already finished the phase 1, phase 2 clinical trial for only single dose program, and the data has demonstrated the safety and immunogenicity is really good. So that is why we, first of all, to design a one-dose program in the pandemic situation. And currently, we also are trying to do another clinical trial for the boost strategy, which means one dose can give a good protection in pandemic situation, but maybe we can give another boost for the better protection in future in the routine immunization program. So that's really a critical part for the scientist for achieve that goal. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you, Mahesh.
Yes, Tyson, I think both Jing and Alex articulated very well the three important challenges we see through the entire production process, right from seed to bulk to fill and finish to distribution, is this whole temperature controlled logistics, right? Whether it's 2 to 8 or minus 70 cryo temperatures and so on. Second big one is the visibility into the inventory itself, right? Quantity available at the right place, right time, and dynamically adjusting the demand supply based on the demand and so on. And the last piece is the security challenge, the theft and diversion and taking appropriate measures here. So let me talk a little bit about what can be done, right? I think the foremost thing is having this end-to-end visibility, both in the upstream and the downstream processes, using some of these modern digital technologies to provide context and condition location data is going to be a very crucial thing in the safe and secure distribution. So a lot of work is being done in sensor technologies, IoT, AI/ML kind of cloud technologies, really accelerating them into the market to help with this whole distribution and logistics challenge.
Thank you. Alex.
Thank you. And I think a lot's been said already. I guess I would start by saying, in some ways, if this is a standard vaccine that looks like other vaccines, maybe the challenge is not as great as we all fear. So by that I mean, if it's a 2 to 8 vaccine with a long shelf life in a fairly standard size and presentation, countries have experience doing that. Even the poorest countries are reaching 4 in every 5 children routinely with a full course of vaccines, which means the supply chains are there to reach most communities, even in those countries. The challenge will come if the vaccine looks different, and it could look different in a number of ways. It could look different, as we already talked about, in terms of cold chain. It will also likely look different in terms of shelf life, with much shorter shelf lives, at least initially, till we get better data. And then, of course, there is going to be the scarcity, which I mentioned already. So I think in terms of solutions, to me, to take each in turn, I think on the cold chain needs, we are already looking at what are the options in terms of building sort of bridge solutions or surge capacity for ultra cold chain if it's needed. Because the reality is none of these vaccines are expected to need it in the long term. So we don't want to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on building an ultra cold chain everywhere if we don't need it. But are there ways of working with the private sector, for example, to use their capabilities to deploy it in a time-limited way where it's needed from other sectors, like, for example, agriculture, where it is used more routinely? On the second point around shelf life, this, it will require countries to really distribute the vaccine much more efficiently than they typically do. Distribution remains, certainly in the poorest countries, one of the weaker areas of supply chains. And it's okay if a vaccine has 2 years of shelf life, but if it only has 2 months, it can't sit in a central warehouse for months before anyone ships it to anywhere else. It's going to have to go very quickly through the system. And so I think we have to look at different delivery models for how the vaccine will actually reach those areas where it's needed, or how people who need it come to where it's available, and there are trade-offs in that. And then I think that on the third around traceability, we are, I think it is an opportunity in some ways to bring new ways of new systems for supply chain visibility and supply chain traceability to countries, and use the urgency of COVID to bring some of those digital technologies, which do exist but haven't been deployed at scale, and to use this as an opportunity for innovation.
Thank you. Scott, what would you like to add?
First of all, let me just say I love everything that's been said, especially this last observation that this is a real opportunity for innovation in distribution chains, especially in developing countries. I think we should, sort of extend that insight to think at every stage of the chain, right? It's, top of chain ingredients, the same story. When you're talking about things like bioreactors, we're producing vaccines at scales we've never produced before, which means a lot of these top of chain inputs or the production sort of structures that make those inputs, like the bioreactors, need to be larger or higher yield than ever before. So there's a lot of investment in innovation and technology around, making sure that we actually have the inputs to the production process at the right scales. And again, we might see repurposing, just like you might see repurposing for cold chains, you might see repurposing of bioreactors from food production and other sources. Towards all of this, it's really important that we get as much information as quickly as we can about which vaccine candidates are likely to succeed, and that we invest in capacity that's substitutable across different candidates, so that you have the most capacity that you can deploy towards any individual production process as early as possible.
Good. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Chris for our next question.
Oh, thank you very much. I'd like to build on this. What are the bottlenecks, or what are the rate limiting factors that will define the speed of deployment and the global capacity? So bottlenecks and rate limiting factors defining the speed of capacity and global speed of deployment and global capacity.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Well, when the pandemic occurred, we asked us a lot of questions about if 17 years ago, when SARS came, if we can have a better mechanism for the vaccine preparation, what was going on this pandemic. So from our perspective, we believe that the most bottleneck from the systems point of view is we need to set up emergency reserve mechanism for vaccine products. For example, currently we all know that we need the hundreds of millions of doses in such a short term, but no manufacturers can do that. No companies has already set up such huge capacity for vaccine productions. And to maintain a vaccine facility is really critical. We need to invest a lot. So currently we see that all of the manufacturers, we are, rushing the facility building, the capacity build up for this single vaccines. But if the disaster pass by, when the pandemic is over, what that huge facility is going to do? Be destroyed, or just prepare for next coming pandemic in the future? We don't know. So the global, the kind of vaccine reserve mechanism we believe should set up from now on by the countries, or maybe WHO, all the countries with the capability to do that. It's easy to see, hey, let's set up a huge capacity, but it's just really hard for vaccine manufacturer to do it. We also know that to maintain a manufacturing facility is really costly. We will maintain the sterile environment for biological products, such as we have to maintain the environment to control the dust particle, the float bacterial, the humidity, temperature. That will invest a lot for all of the vaccine manufacturers. So how to set up that kind of a reserve mechanism to maintain that facility, to let all of the manufacturers can afford to prepare the next pandemic probably happen in the future. We don't know when, That is really, really critical. That the big lesson learned we have from this pandemic. Yeah.
Thank you. Right. Fish.
So Chris, some of the rate limiting factors are obviously the production capacity, the cold storage capacity, right place, right locations, right? Especially in the last mile delivery, if you need cryo temperatures, most facilities are not set up for that. And the transport, obviously, right? There was an article from Emirates or somebody, you need almost 8,000 jumbo jets to move around the kind of quantities we're talking, and the delivery and administration in the last mile. So that's one aspect. Then if you look at the systems, we found a lot of data silos, manual processes in the logistics and distribution chain, right? For across that source, make, deliver systems, and lack of that leads to lack of communication, collaboration between all the functions, suppliers and the administrators. So that's a huge problem, and any failures in that operations logistics could be catastrophic when you're moving billions of these vaccines around. Again, these modern digital tools, we feel, will help mitigate some of these issues, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. Alex.
So I think the previous two speakers have spoken eloquently to the more upstream pieces. So I'll focus on maybe the in-country pieces. I think within, as I said previously, there are existing supply chains in place, and the modelling we've done so far suggests that even in the poorest countries, that at the actual service delivery level, the capacity is, at least the cold chain capacity, is actually adequate given the strengths that given the strengthening that's been done over recent years. Gavi alone helped countries procure 40,000 additional cold chain devices just since 2017. I think where we're seeing bottlenecks is higher up the chain, where you're suddenly going to get a large number of doses in a national warehouse or in a regional warehouse all at the same time. By the time you get down to service delivery levels, the volumes are small enough that it's probably manageable. But that, of course, does depend on it being a vaccine that can be stored in the current 2 to 8 or minus 20 cold chain. If it's not, then it's a much bigger challenge. I think the other rate limiting factor that that I would mention is the actual distribution. And in addition to the capacity, I think one of the key questions that still has to be worked out, and it's going to have to be decided country by country, is where is immunization going to happen? Because we're talking about a different target population. We're not talking about children, which is who we're typically immunizing. We're talking about adults, and we're talking not just about all adults, we're talking about specific subsets of adults. So healthcare workers likely initially, then other high-risk groups, the elderly or those with comorbidities. And it may or may not be that immunization of those groups happens in the traditional way in a health facility. And so we also need supply chains that are flexible enough that they can actually deliver to where the immunization is going to happen, and that may be different from where they're used to delivering to. So not only are they starting from a place where distribution isn't always as efficient as we'd like, but they're also going to have to be flexible to the needs of COVID vaccine delivery.
Okay. Scott.
Yeah, riffing off of that, I mean, I think a big challenge is going to be about regulatory frameworks, right? Figuring out exactly how countries are going to determine who receives vaccines and in what stages and tranches and so forth. And higher up in the chain, we were talking in the last question about repurposing capacity from other use cases. A lot of times the regulatory framework is not yet ready to do that. And so on top of the sort of supply chain level bottlenecks, there are also going to be sort of regulatory or infrastructure bottlenecks that sort of determine how that supply chain is actually sort of processed, how things move through the chain. And so a lot of that groundwork needs to be done early, and it links up also with the ideas Jing was talking about. If we're going to have sort of a long-term, sort of stable, sort of reserve capacity system for responding to pandemics, there needs to be regulatory infrastructure to support that, and funding, of course, as well.
That's true.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Comments from each other? Tyson.
Yeah, we've got a couple minutes for any further comments on system issues or rate limiting factors.
If I may come in, I think one thing I'd say is, I think it's also important that we think about the system from a overall health system point of view and not just a supply chain system point of view, because that allows us to think about the trade-offs that we need to make. And so to the example I was giving around where's immunization happen, it's going to be easier from a supply chain point of view if it happens in fewer places and people come to the service delivery point. But actually, if you're immunizing healthcare workers, that means you need every health worker to leave their clinic and go to where the immunization is happening, and that has its own challenges and risks. So I think as we think about systems, we need to think about supply chain systems, but we also need to think about the overall health systems and the trade-offs within them.
Totally right. And the deployment bottlenecks will also involve, also sort of co-vary with the, sort of strain in the healthcare system, right? If people are, going to be going to healthcare sites or to receive vaccines, if the healthcare system is sort of overburdened, then they might not be able to deliver the vaccines at the same time or as effectively.
It seemed to me there's going to have to be a lot of very rapid learning on the way as we go through this. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Shende, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the speed of the R&D associated with the vaccine for COVID-19. I think part of the reasons that some of the Chinese companies have been able to develop the vaccine quite quickly is because they have accumulated some of the experience through SARS and MERS. My first question is to Jing. How much is the experience that companies gained during SARS and MERS have really kind of helped with the speed of development and also the response speeds of the supply chain for vaccine for COVID-19?
Okay, thank you, Shende. Well, this is the question not only for Chinese vaccine developers, this is for all of the developers around the world. We all know that 17 years ago, when we found SARS as a virus, it took the human being for a couple months to figure out what this virus is. But for this time, it only takes 7 days. So this is a huge, dramatic development since last 17 years in global wide for the biotechnologies. So, the people share the biotechnologies and accelerate the gene screening and the diagnostic testing for those kind of virus. And also, we all know that most of the manufacturers now are focused on one antigen as a vaccine is the spike protein. One we can focus on to choose this specific protein as the antigen for the base of development of vaccine is because the biological knowledge we accumulate in the past few years by SARS and MERS and make us know that maybe that kind of the surface protein will be the target for the vaccine. So this is for the really valuable for all of us. But for the manufacturing point of view, as I said before, we don't think that we set up a manufacturing system to prevent those kind of the virus like SARS and MERS. So now, to us, everybody want to say, hey, can you be faster? No, we already be the fastest in the world. So, well, we do accumulate a lot of knowledge and experience, but not enough. So for us, we actually can develop the vaccine in such a short term is based on the knowledge by developing the Ebola virus vaccine. We successfully developed that vaccine based on a similar viral vector based technology platform, and we successfully registered it. And we do have a lot of experience in CMC part in our industries. That means chemical manufacturing and control process, which is really critical to develop a vaccine products. So we do have a lot of those experience, so we can fast develop this COVID-19 vaccine in such short term with that mature technology platform. That is really critical for us and for all of the countries. And we all know that through this pandemic, we see a very innovative technology named mRNA technology platform. And we believe that this can really accelerate the usage and the development of this technology platform globally, not only for vaccine currently, also for other medicines, drugs in the future. That's really valuable as well.
That's very interesting. Yeah, for the other panelists from companies, I'd like to ask you a similar question, but you may not really have that much experience with SARS or MERS. But what are some of the key technology or key knowledge accumulation, and also maybe some key data that you accumulated in the past, which really helped you to really improve the speed in the R&D and also in designing and managing the supply chain for the vaccine for COVID-19. So who would like to go first to share what knowledge that you had in the past, what experience or data you had in the past, which really helped you to improve the speed and the response and the efficiency of the vaccine supply chain for COVID-19?
This is Mahesh.
Go for it, Mahesh.
Sorry, Alex. No, I was just going to say I could throw some light from a logistics and distribution perspective, Jande. So people move pretty fast here, at least in North America. We've seen learnings from several, right? Like the Japan tsunami, and how do you mobilize logistics? We see a lot of that. Pfizer, for example, right about the time when they launched in March or so, they started the distribution efforts parallelly, like creating kind of these cold storage boxes, holding capacity with the cargo carriers or distribution routes and so on, closer to the clinics and hospitals and so on. So a lot of the ecosystem players we've been noticing accelerated their digitization plans by at least 12 to 18 months, and using most of the cold chains typically use data logger technologies, which is passive, and you don't know something happened until after it happened. So now they're using much more modern sensor technologies and cloud and AML to really digitize this entire supply chain operation to gain better visibility before something happens, right? So that's one of the trends we've noticed right as things kicked off in February, March.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Alex.
Thank you. And I think maybe I'll talk to three examples. I think the first is H1N1. And I think that was an example of what we didn't want to repeat in terms of ensuring equitable access to vaccines around the world. And I think that's why we created this time the COVAX facility, which is designed precisely to ensure there is equitable access to and allocation of the vaccines that are available. And so to me, that's a critical first lesson, is that, a pandemic, we can only stop a pandemic if we can reach the people everywhere, and we needed a mechanism to be able to do that, and we hope the COVAX facility will prove to be that mechanism. We currently have over 180 countries who are signed up to it, and so that is the vast majority of the world's population, and hopefully that will give us an ability to avoid the mistakes of H1N1. I think the second example I'd give is actually routine immunization. Since Gavi was created in 2000, we've supported countries to introduce over 500 vaccines and immunization campaigns. And that means that in addition to the increase in coverage, which I mentioned earlier, the number of doses that countries are actually delivering has gone up very, very, very significantly. And last year, we estimate over 800 million in routine immunization and hundreds of millions more through campaigns. And countries have a machinery for what it takes now to introduce a vaccine. Back when Gavi was founded, it was seen as a sort of almost impossible challenge to help some of the world's poorest countries introduce new vaccines. But now, even some of the most fragile states in the world have introduced vaccines. And in fact, coverage of pneumococcal vaccine and rotavirus vaccine, which protects against two of the largest killers of children, is now higher in the poorest countries than it is in the rest of the world. And so they do know how to do this. There is a real expertise and experience in country. Obviously, this will be a different challenge. And I think as we get clearer on the vaccines we are dealing with, we'll have to look at what are the examples we can learn from. So for example, if it does turn out this vaccine needs ultra cold chain, we'll have to draw from the experience of the Ebola vaccine, which also needed ultra cold chain. And while it was only deployed in 6 countries in total, there are lessons we can draw from that. Those lessons do suggest it will be very expensive and very complex if we end up going down that road, but at least we've had the opportunity to test it, to understand what it takes, and we can draw from that as we go forward. So I think that will also, a bit to Chris's point earlier, we're going to have to continue to learn and continue to look at where we draw the thinking from as we get more clarity on exactly what this vaccine is going to look like, when it's going to be available, and in what quantities.
That's great. Scott, as a researcher, would you like to share your perspective as to what we can learn from the past, what we can learn from the present for the future?
Perfect. So first of all, just I want to echo like pretty much everything my co-panelists have said. From the research perspective and plugging in with some of the work that Gabby's done, we've learned a lot about how to finance, sort of vaccine production and delivery. There's been a lot of work on advanced market commitments, including, the Gabby pneumococcal advanced market commitment that have helped us understand how you can better finance deploying vaccines to large populations, across countries, some of whom may not themselves be able to invest in the full production on their own. And then the other thing that's sort of looking towards the future is that through this pandemic, we've learned a lot about vaccine collaboration, through the COVAX facility and sort of through the international collaborations on development. We've learned a lot about how to build out these supply chains at scales and efficiencies that are unprecedented. We have to not lose all of that knowledge. Right, it's really important to make sure that we actually sort of build a preparedness plan in the future that uses everything we've learned now. And again, as we were talking about before, in Jing's comments, right, maintains capacity, for future production, but also sort of maintains these collaborative infrastructure pieces, right? The connections between different countries and institutions that are going to sort of help the countries collaborate and deploy vaccines as quickly as possible. All of that we sort of should take our learnings now and keep using.
That's great. So we have a lot to learn. I think maybe we also have something to de-learn. And hopefully through our research, we can better inform future decision makers. Thank you.
We're going to talk next about product development, product design, testing, deployment. How can these things take into consideration some of the supply chain robustness and capacity issues? In other words, the design, the development of a vaccine, we tend to focus on health efficacy issues, but like I think we've mentioned already with cold chain or number of doses, there are other distribution-oriented factors to consider and what makes the best vaccine candidate. So what thoughts do you have on design for supply chain or design for resilience or other design for X attributes of a great vaccine candidate? Jane, we'll start with you.
Well, I actually have posted out the views from manufacturer's point of view. As you know, that the temperature, the stability, try to make the vaccine as stable as possible, and to keep one dose immunization program. Maintain with the enough safety and efficacy profile. That will be the most ideal vaccines. Also, I believe that is from Gavi's and UNICEF's point of view, will save more cost from the logistics point of view. But I would like to say that we believe that the supply chain the pathway for vaccination is well established in some countries like China or many developed countries, but we also have a lot of countries have really weak system. They have to rely on the NGOs like Bill Melinda Gates Foundation, UNICEF. So this should be but the virus and the infectious disease are only one plan away from all of us. So this is really a global collaboration as what those NGOs is doing right now. But we need more efforts from all of the countries to facilitate this issues on the supply chain. So well, that's my comments.
Thank you, Mahesh. Anything to add there?
Yeah, Tyson, I could throw a couple of ideas from a design for the supply chain and resilience perspective and some of the things happening in the technology world from my lens. So, I mean, obviously there is a lot of discussion about rethinking some of these key supplier and partner locations, building redundancy into that by nearshoring and so on, right? Because of disruptions in logistics and trade lanes and so on. So sourcing critical ingredients from multiple suppliers and so on. As it is, it's a complex global supply chain. So how do you kind of mitigate this? Some of the interesting, exciting tech developments we see is a technology called digital twin. This is something you can deploy to capture data on the end-to-end on your operations, inventory movements, risks as they're happening, and you can enable scenario planning and prediction. What happens if this link goes down? What happens if this route has a capacity constraint and so on? So you can make the whole system more efficient and so on. And companies are starting to deploy these and accelerating these efforts now, which is encouraging.
Thank you. Alex, anything to add here?
Yes, I think, first of all, just to say, this is having just said in my previous response that, countries have a lot of experience delivering large numbers of vaccines, which is true. I think we also need to acknowledge that this is a different, this can be different on multiple dimensions. It's a different target population, different profiles of vaccines, and frankly, a different scale. And, for the COVAX facility alone, we're trying to deliver 2 billion doses by the end of next year. So, and we're doing that, we're asking then health systems to deliver at a time when they're already stretched both by the impact that COVID is having and the need to respond to COVID, and by attempts to try and maintain other services, and by the fact that there's actually indirect impact on their overall capacity, whether that's healthcare workers getting sick, lockdowns making it harder, getting in the way of service provision, etc. So, I think the overriding, my overriding answer would be to say, the more we can do in the design of the vaccine to reduce logistical complexity, the better. To me, 3 key dimensions. One would be to minimize the number of doses. If we can have a single dose vaccine, that would be fabulous. Right now, it looks like most will be 2 doses, and that will add a lot more logistical complexity, both on the vaccine supply chain, but also on the actual delivery side, because we're going to have to track who's had which vaccine and how many doses. Secondly, as we've talked about already, trying to ensure the vaccine can be stored out in a normal temperature range, at least for a number of months, if not longer. Thirdly, having as long a shelf life as possible and generating the data that's needed to do that as quickly as possible. And then lastly, I think thinking about also the presentation and the packaging and making that as simple for people throughout the supply chain, especially the health worker, but also supply chain workers as possible. And that probably means making it as similar as possible to what they already have and what they're already used to, whether that's the injection device, whether that's the packaging, whether that's having, in Gavi countries at least, a vaccine biomonitor so you can check whether it's been exposed to excessive temperatures. So I think overall simplicity, and simplicity probably means as close as possible to what people are familiar with.
Very good. Scott?
Completely agreed. Just jumping off the simplicity point, I think it's very important to think about standardization, right? We'd like it to be the case that all of the different vaccine products, to the extent that they can, use similarly sized vials, similar delivery processes, labeling conventions need to be standardized and fixed early, and preferably as flexible as they can be, so that vaccines that are filled and finished in one location can be used in as many other locations as possible. And so, we need agreements on these standards, and they need to be sort of, propagated through the system as quickly as possible. I think that's the main thing to add on robustness. I guess the other thing that's very important, we highlighted earlier, is standardizing, substitutable inputs, like making it possible to, sort of especially produce large quantities of the inputs that are substitutable across many different vaccine candidates as quickly as possible is very important.
Excellent. And with that, I'll hand over to Suzanne for our last questions.
Great. So part of the reason why we're together is to stimulate each other to think in some unusual ways. And so I suggest that we close with a thought experiment. So when we go back to some of what's been said, Jean, Scott, Alex, especially. So on one hand, pandemics come, we need huge capacity, but then when the pandemics go, we're stuck with that capacity. What do we do with it? And that doesn't really work. Now, if we think about the vaccine as a service, and we think in terms of something more like a restaurant or a hairdresser or a medical clinic, and we would create capacity that can then turn raw materials into a dose, it can work. Now, it looks more expensive, but I use quantitative finance models to value the options that are created. And it turns out that there's a lot of money on the table when you avoid not making things that you don't need, and you have vaccines available and you can quickly get them to people when you need it. And when you can combine the two, a little bit like flying business class versus flying economy class, it's the same airplane. If supply chain people organized air transportation, we would have two different airplanes. Mm-hmm. So what I'd like to do is just have a dream where we would set up a vaccine service provider that could provide a variety of vaccines, including keeping it open to all of the crazy ideas. Is it mRNA, or is it, like what kind of vaccine? And what would this look like? Is this interesting? Can you get crazy with me? So Jean, over to you. Let's see your inner craziness.
Yeah, this is a really ideal perspective. All of the vaccine manufacturing, we are dreaming to have a one-for-all technology solution. But this is really hard in vaccine development and in manufacturing. Unlike the small molecule medicines or other biological medicines such as antibody, they can have some common technology platform. But the sources that lead to infectious disease are many. There are a lot of kind of microbials or microorganisms, such as viruses, bacterial, mycoplasma, plasmodium, so many different kind of the microbials. So, which means when we develop a vaccine, we see an antigen, we will deal with the viruses, bacterial, proteins, polysaccharides, toxins. We may use the technology platform like the inactivation, a new VLP technology, which means it's a virus-like particle technology, viral vectors like what we are using now, as well as the Oxfords and the Johnson Johnson's, and mRNA. So that is a big combination of a chemical or biological processes. It's really, really complicated. So well, it's a dream for the scientists in vaccine development era, but this takes maybe even longer time to achieve that goal. But what I want to say is that, the prevention and control of infection diseases are in the public health domain. So sometimes it will need more governments of all countries and companies to work together to build up a robust, strong defense mechanism to fight against the epidemic and the pandemic now, or maybe next time, we don't know, but nobody knows when it will come. But it's really need us to invest a lot and maybe more to to set up that mechanism in the future. But we believe that that will be a goal maybe we can achieve in future, but it's not really that easy now.
Great, thank you. Mahesh, over to you.
Yes, Suzanne. So I think Jing talked eloquently about the production side of the dream. Looking at the distribution and delivery, I almost imagine a service like Amazon or something, right? You click, and then the service is delivered for you or the next day or same day. So how do you achieve that? Like a reconfigurable on-demand kind of supply chain. Means near optimal visibility into both upstream and the downstream processes, right from demand signals to planning and execution through the operations, right? So all that means data, right? And today data is one of the hardest ones. A lot of data silos across that value chain, and they need to be broken down and building that ground truth from operations. So I think it's a huge task across the value chain to build, but COVID in a weird way has seriously accelerated what industry is calling this whole digital transformation, and a lot of implementations are being accelerated we've seen by at least 12 to 18 months, and hopefully this will be make us better prepared for future. So that's how I see Amazon-like service for reconfigurable delivery.
Interesting, great. Thank you very much, Mahesh. Alex, over to you.
Thank you. And I think picking up on what Mahesh was describing, in a funny way, it's sort of what Gavi has tried to do for the world's poorest countries. I'm not sure which claim to be Amazon, but the idea is to be able to aggregate demand for more than half the world's children and provide some visibility and predictability to manufacturers for what's going to be needed. And for routine immunization, that works because actually, once a vaccine is in a country's immunization schedule, yes, there may be ups and downs in terms of the specific amount they need from one year to the next, but on the whole, it's fairly predictable. And when you aggregate it across multiple countries, is much easier to manage. And so I think for routine immunization, we have an approximation of what you were describing. The challenge is when we get a new disease that isn't in routine immunization and that we need to respond to rapidly. And I think for that, it's really a question of how do we invest in the, as Jing was describing, the upstream technology platforms and early stage research to make sure we're as far advanced as we can be. We're lucky in this pandemic that it happened after CEPI was set up and not before, because they had already begun some of that, as had others. But so how do we do that? How do we ensure there's excess manufacturing capacity available? At least we're ready to scale up rapidly. And then how do we ensure also that countries are ready to adapt with things like, for example, the regulatory adaptations that will be needed to rapidly begin, introduce a new vaccine, especially potentially one that's been through an accelerated development process. All of those are things that I think we could have, but they all come with a cost. And so I think a lot of it comes down to what is our willingness as a global community to invest in in being ready for the next pandemic by having some of those capacities ready to go.
Great points. Thank you. Scott, over to you.
Awesome. So again, completely agreed. The benefit and being at the very end of the sequences, you have all the chain of comments before you. As we're thinking about expanding sort of capacities going forward, one place that we can be working is on inputs that are used in many different types of vaccines and are relatively sort of individual. So you can be looking at synthetic, adjuvants, or expanding bioreactor capacity and yield. Or as Alex was just saying, regulatory structure, right? You can be, sort of bringing some of these newer technology platforms through the regulatory pipeline so that they're ready to be deployed sort of on the spot when you need them. But then, sort of you asked for a wild and sort of a wild idea. The other thing that would have been lovely to see at this moment was some way to borrow capacity across industries or across different, pharmaceutical producers so that you could, take what, the extent, that we have a supply chain that can produce these types of inputs and products and reconfigure it on the fly to work on vaccines. And indeed, we've seen similar sorts of reconfigurations around hand sanitizer, around other sorts of disinfectants. But of course, for pharmaceuticals, the regulatory infrastructure is much more complicated. And the challenges are much greater, right? You're building a much more complicated product that needs to be made under much more sensitive conditions. And so figuring out how to build that sort of fully reconfigurable vaccine chain is a great but pretty exciting challenge if it could be done.
Great, wonderful. So our time is up, although I think we would all like to stay here for another couple of hours or so. I think we're just getting warmed up. So first of all, I would like to thank all the panelists and the guest editors for this insightful and rich discussion. Just every moment has been really great, and it's been a pleasure to be with you. A couple of takeaways to think about. What comes clearly out of the discussion is that we need to excel at push for this vaccine supply chain, but we also need to excel at pull. In supply chain management, we've got these traditional trade-offs between efficiency and responsiveness, and if we choose between efficiency and responsiveness, we are going to fail. And it becomes more complicated when we add in the need to have resilience, which is being prepared for unknown unknowns. Second thing is, what is coming out of this context is that we have massive data. This is useful in forecasting demand. It's useful in figuring out where stuff is. Mahesh was talking about visibility, and also it's useful in supporting ongoing vaccine development. But the thing is that our ability to act on that data is only as good as we have in the supply chain, the responsiveness and the resilience to act on what we learn from the data. And otherwise, we're just another bunch of people going around incanting big data. That we must be thinking in terms of the systems, the bottlenecks and the rate limiting resources. Scott mentioned the importance of synthetic adjuvants, because it turns out that there are some things in an article that he wrote for Bloomberg. He mentioned horseshoe crab blood as being every vaccine needs it, and there's a limited supply in the globe. So we need to know what these rate limiting resources are, and we need to collectively be focused on them. And then finally, looking for push-pull synergies, ways to create capacity buffers to provide responsiveness and resilience. And then when those capacity buffers are not used, to find creative ways to use them, for example, serving the developing world, working together with organizations like Gavi, or other healthcare or other services. So with that, I'll pass it back over to Tyson.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you for our panelists' insights. They were wonderful, great perspectives coming from different aspects of this very important supply chain. And thank you to our special issue guest editors for their participation and their work on the special issue. Our deadline for submissions is January 31st of 2021. So please be submitting those papers to the special issue. And special thanks to Suzanne for being the prime mover behind our panel today and getting this event organized. She's really been the one who's pushed the most to make this happen, and we're most appreciative of how well it's gone.
Well, it was worth every second.
Yes. So thanks again to everyone. And I think my summary of all this would be that confronting the pandemic really requires not only our best supply chain skills, but also just a general willingness to see this as a system problem holistically, and how locally optimal outcomes aren't necessarily going to make globally optimal outcomes. So perhaps just more generally, unselfishness is a key ingredient here to making this work in a globally optimal way. Hopefully our discussion today will help contribute towards the most beneficial responses. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for organizing it, for having us.
Thank you for organizing it. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.